Turn that pump back on now. Ma'am, this is my well. I'm just replacing the filter. I don't care. 62 homes have no water because of you. My children can't bathe. My toilets won't flush. And you're standing there in your disgusting boots telling me about filters. It's my property, my well, my pump. Your property, she laughed like I'd said something pitiful. Nobody cares about your sad little ranch. I already called 911. When they get here, you'll turn it on, or I'll make sure you never turn anything on again. I turned it back on, and that's when I discovered why 62 homes went dry the moment I shut off my own well. A well she had no contract for, no right to, and no idea I'd spent 10 years tracing stolen water for a living. But let me back up, because this story doesn't start with a 911 call. It starts with a well. The well sat 60 feet behind my house, capped with a steel plate my grandfather welded himself in the summer of 1962. He was a cattleman named Walter Whitfield who believed two things would outlast everything else in the Texas Hill Country: limestone and good water. He was right about both. He drilled 312 feet down into the Edwards Aquifer and hit a vein so clean the county tested it twice because they didn't believe the numbers. That well fed our cattle, our garden, our kitchen sink, and every living thing on 1,200 acres of Blanco County ranchland for over 60 years. My father Earl built the rest, a 6-inch main line running north to south along the western ridge, branch lines to every pasture, every trough, every stock tank. He mapped every foot of pipe by hand on graph paper and kept the drawings in a fireproof cabinet next to his marriage certificate and the deed. That's how seriously he took it. Water wasn't a utility in our family, it was inheritance. I came back 2 years ago after Dad passed. I'd spent a decade in Austin working as a civil engineer, specializing in municipal water infrastructure, pressure systems, flow dynamics, contamination tracing, the kind of work where you spend your days making sure 500,000 people can flush their toilets without thinking about it. I was good at it, but when the cancer took Dad in 14 months, I drove home, buried him next to Mom under the live oaks, and never went back to the office. The ranch needed me. The mornings smelled like cedar smoke and wet limestone, and the evenings tasted like dust and diesel from the old tractor Dad never replaced. 180 head of Hereford cattle needed me, and the well, Grandpa's well, needed someone who understood what 60 years of mineral deposits, shifting aquifer pressure, and hill country summers could do to a pump system if you ignored it. Ridgecrest Estates appeared 9 years before I came home. 62 houses built on 400 acres of what used to be the Dawson Ranch next door. The developer, a man named Glenn Caldwell, bought the land, bulldozed the mesquite, and dropped cookie-cutter homes on half-acre lots with HOA fees, a clubhouse, and a community pool shaped like the state of Texas. The brochures promised hill country living with modern convenience. What they didn't mention was where the water came from. I first met Linda Caldwell on a Wednesday afternoon in March, 3 weeks after I moved in. She pulled up my gravel drive in a white Cadillac Escalade, so clean it looked like it had never touched a Texas road. She stepped out in a linen sundress, Gucci sunglasses pushed up into platinum blonde hair, and heels that had no business being within a mile of a cattle ranch. She was beautiful, the way a coral snake is beautiful, the kind of pretty that makes you stop and look right before it kills you. She carried a leather portfolio with the Ridgecrest Estates HOA logo embossed in gold. She smiled like we were old friends, then she opened her mouth. "Mr. Whitfield, your cattle operation is producing odors that are affecting our residents' quality of life. I'm here to discuss solutions." She said the word solutions the way a surgeon says options, polite, clinical, and loaded with the implication that only one of them involved survival. I told her my family had been ranching this land since 1958, and the cattle weren't going anywhere. She tilted her head, smiled wider, the kind of smile that rearranges a face without reaching the eyes, and said she understood completely. Then she clicked her heels back to the Escalade, and I watched her drive away trailing a cloud of limestone dust that settled on her windshield like a warning she didn't bother to read. The letters started the following week. Official Ridgecrest Estates HOA stationery, cream-colored, watermarked, printed in a serif font that screamed we retained a graphic designer before we retained a plumber. The first one informed me that my perimeter fence was inconsistent with the aesthetic standards of the surrounding community. My fence was barbed wire on cedar posts. It had been there since 1974. Ridgecrest had been there since 2015, but Linda Caldwell operated on the principle that whoever prints the letterhead makes the rules. The second letter complained about dust. My cattle walking across dry pasture created airborne particulate matter that was, quote, degrading the respiratory environment of Ridgecrest residents. I read that sentence 3 times and still couldn't decide if it was a health complaint or a graduate thesis on the dangers of living next to dirt. The third letter was my favorite. It stated that my livestock were engaging in, and I am not making this up, aggressive visual trespass. Apparently my Herefords had been standing near the fence line and staring into Ridgecrest backyards in a manner that several residents found intimidating and unsettling. I walked out to the pasture and looked. 1,400-pound cows were chewing cud and blinking at the horizon with the emotional intensity of a stuffed animal. If that was aggression, my entire herd deserved an Oscar for subtlety. Linda didn't stop at letters. She called Blanco County Animal Control and reported my cattle as dangerous and uncontained. An inspector named Phil drove out, walked the fence line, watched my cows eat grass for about 4 minutes, and said he'd seen more threat in a church parking lot. He drove away without issuing a citation. 2 weeks later, Linda petitioned the county zoning board for a livestock density limit on properties adjacent to Ridgecrest. My herd capped at 20 head on 1,200 acres, a ratio so absurd the animal would die of loneliness before finding a blade of grass worth chewing. She got 34 signatures going door to door with a bottle of wine in one hand and her portfolio in the other. Most people signed because it was easier than arguing with a beautiful woman holding a Cabernet and a clipboard. Nobody signed because they'd read the actual text. But old Hank Morrison, my neighbor to the north, 61 and still running cattle the way his granddaddy taught him, brought me a copy and tapped signature number 19, Gerald Faulkner, a Ridgecrest resident dead for 2 years, heart attack in his kitchen. His widow still lived in the house. His handwriting did not still sign petitions. She forged a dead man's name, Hank said, leaning against my truck. That woman could sell ice to a polar bear and make him feel guilty for not buying more. I filed the forgery with the county clerk. Nothing came of it. The petition died at the zoning board anyway. They had no authority over agricultural land that predated the subdivision by 4 decades. Linda's response was a 5th letter, requesting I replace my ranch gate with something more welcoming to the community aesthetic. My gate was a steel frame my father welded in 1991, his initials on the crossbar. I hung her letter on the refrigerator next to a photo of him and went back to feeding cattle. But something about the whole campaign bothered me beyond the usual irritation. Not the forgery, that was just Linda being Linda, a woman so devoted to control she drafted the deceased into her voter rolls. What nagged me was the intensity. She was spending real time, real effort, and real social capital on a fight she couldn't win. Nobody works that hard to complain about cow smell unless they're protecting something they can't afford to lose. I didn't know what it was yet, but I was starting to pay attention. The first Tuesday of October I shut the pump down. Same thing I did every year. Same thing my father did every year before me. You run a well in the hill country, you maintain it. Pull the filter housing, flush the sediment lines, check the pressure switch, grease the motor bearings. It takes about 8 hours. During those 8 hours, no water moves through the main line. The cattle drink from the stock tanks I'd filled the night before. The house runs on the cistern. Everything is planned. Everything is routine. What was not routine was what happened at the other end of my pipe. By noon, my phone started buzzing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I let them go to voicemail. The first message was a woman I'd never met asking if I knew why her kitchen faucet had stopped working. The second was a man demanding to know if there was construction on the main line. The third was Linda Caldwell, and she wasn't asking. Mr. Whitfield, I don't know what you're doing out there, but 62 families have no running water. Fix it now. I stared at the phone for a long time. My ranch, my well, my pump, and 62 families I'd never supplied were calling me because their taps went dry the same hour I turned off my own equipment. At 12:47, Linda called 911. I know the exact time because I requested the transcript later. The recording was a masterpiece of suburban emergency theater. She started with tears, the kind of perfectly timed crying that sounds rehearsed if you've heard it more than once. She told the dispatcher there were children without drinking water, elderly residents who couldn't flush toilets, and that this constituted a public health emergency requiring immediate response. The dispatcher asked if she'd contacted her water provider. Linda paused. The pause lasted 4 seconds, an eternity on a 911 recording. Then she said, "We don't have a water provider. The water just comes." I played that line back 3 times. She'd been HOA president for 8 years, collecting dues, enforcing fence colors, and policing the angle of people's mailbox flags, and she could not name where her community's water came from. It just came, like magic, like divine entitlement, like the universe owed her plumbing. Sheriff Tom Avery pulled up my drive at 1:15 in a county cruiser, stepping out with the deliberate patience of a man who'd been doing this job for 20 years and had learned that most emergencies aren't. He was 55, built like a fence post, and had a voice that made you feel like you were already in trouble even when you weren't. I liked him immediately. "Cole, you know anything about Ridgecrest losing water?" I told him what I'd done, turned off my pump on my property for annual maintenance on a well my grandfather drilled before Ridgecrest was a cow pasture. He nodded slowly, the way lawmen nod when the math doesn't add up, but the law clearly does. "So why would your pump affect their water?" "That's exactly what I'd like to know, Sheriff." He drove to Ridgecrest, talked to some residents, came back 40 minutes later, and told me Linda had demanded he arrest me for sabotaging community infrastructure. He said it with a straight face, which I respected because I couldn't have. I finished the maintenance at 6:00 that evening, replaced the filter cartridge, flushed the sediment, reseated the pressure switch, and flipped the pump back on. Within 20 minutes, Ridgecrest had water again. I didn't need a degree in hydrology to understand what that meant, but I had one anyway. That night I pulled Dad's pipe maps and checked the gauge. The well used to hold steady at 58 psi year-round, steady as a heartbeat. It now read 41, 17 pounds gone. That's not wear, that's not age, that's demand. Someone was pulling water I hadn't authorized in volumes I hadn't accounted for through a connection I'd never seen. I sat on the pump house step and listened to the night, the low hum of the motor, the cicadas grinding their endless shift, the distant lowing of cattle settling in for sleep. I'd spent 10 years tracing leaks in city systems, finding unauthorized taps in municipal lines, tracking pressure drops to illegal connections. I never thought I'd use those skills on my own ranch. But somewhere between my well and Linda Caldwell's perfect subdivision, there was a pipe that didn't belong. And I was going to find it. I called Darrell Voss the next morning, a hydrological engineer out of San Marcos who'd consulted on water theft cases for 3 counties and testified in federal court twice. He showed up Thursday loaded with equipment, flow meters, acoustic leak detectors, pressure transducers, a GPS unit accurate to 6 inches. We started at the wellhead and worked south along the main line, taking readings every 50 feet. Clean at 57 psi outbound, 55 at the first branch, 53 at the second. Textbook. Then we hit boundary marker 14, where my property met Ridgecrest, and the pressure fell off a cliff. 53 dropped to 40, 13 pounds gone in under 80 feet. Darrell crouched down, put his hand on the ground like he was feeling for a pulse, and looked up at me. "Something's pulling hard right here," he said, "and it ain't your cows." We swept the area with the acoustic detector. 14 feet east of my line, it screamed. I got the shovel. 18 inches down, we found it. A 4-inch PVC pipe, Schedule 40, saddle clamped directly onto my 6-inch main. Sealed with purple primer and solvent cement. It wasn't a mistake or a relic. It was installed by someone who knew exactly whose water they were taking. The PVC ran east under the fence and the Caliche easement road, disappearing into Ridgecrest Estates. Darrell traced it another 200 feet before it connected to a distribution manifold buried under the HOA's decorative median, the one with the limestone sign reading Ridgecrest Estates, a Premier Hill country community. "This isn't engineering," Darrell said, standing in the trench with dirt on his knees. This is theft with a shovel. I photographed everything, 47 photos, 12 minutes of video. Under Texas Water Code 11.081, this wasn't a neighborly dispute. It was felony theft of water resources, punishable by up to 2 years in state prison per offense, with charges that stack if the theft involves falsified construction documents. Linda's Escalade appeared on the Ridge Road while we packed up. Her face went blank for exactly 1 second at the sight of the open trench, then the smile came back. Just checking on some landscaping. You boys playing with pipes out here? She drove off without another word. At the county records office, I spent 40 minutes finding what wasn't there. Ridgecrest's 62 lot permits, master site plan, drainage calculations, but no well permit, no drilling log, no water supply contract, nothing. Tucked behind a drainage easement diagram was a hand-drawn note in blue ink, matching Glenn Caldwell's signature, tie into existing 6 in line at BM 14. Temporary connection, convert to municipal later. 9 years and 7.2 million gallons later, temporary was still doing the heavy lifting. The certificate of occupancy had a checked box for a private well to be drilled prior to occupancy. It was never drilled. A permitted well and treatment system for 62 homes runs $400,000 to $500,000. Glenn spent nothing and pocketed the difference. I called Janet Simmons, a water rights attorney out of Fredericksburg. She looked at the evidence, took off her glasses, and said 5 words: "This man belongs in prison." We built a 4-step strategy. First, an industrial Badger M120 meter bolted onto the tap line. It clocked 2,200 gallons a day. Second, a locking isolation valve upstream, left open for now. Third, simultaneous formal complaints to the TCEQ, the county DA, and the Texas Real Estate Commission, each with the full evidence package, all arriving by certified mail the same day. Under the rule of capture, every drop in my well was mine. Anyone tapping it without agreement wasn't borrowing, they were stealing. Fourth, trail cameras aimed at the meter and the access path. I sent Linda a copy of the TCEQ complaint cover letter myself, case number and all, just to watch her open it. She signed for it on a Wednesday at 10:14 a.m. 3 days later, she called an emergency HOA meeting, telling 62 homeowners that the rancher next door was threatening to cut off their water in an act of environmental hostage-taking, complete with a PowerPoint and a proposed $15,000 per household special assessment, $930,000 to sue the man whose only crime was owning the water she'd stolen. A tear rolled down her cheek on cue. 17 people applauded. Roy Bennett, a Ridgecrest accountant tired of Linda's theatrics, was not one of them. Glenn showed up at my ranch that Saturday, parking sideways across my drive in a Black King Ranch truck like he owned the place. 52, Tanner's old leather, handshake designed to hurt. He got right to it. He was prepared to write me a check for $50,000 right now, cash, to forget the pipe and the complaints. $50,000 for 9 years and 7.2 million gallons, roughly 0.7 of a cent per gallon, less than tap water costs in most American cities. No, I said. His mask slipped. You don't want to make enemies of people who built this county, Whitfield, he warned. You didn't build anything, Glenn, I said. You buried a pipe, forged a permit, and sold 62 families a house with no legal water source. He stood there a few seconds, processing that he'd just been declined by a man in muddy boots next to a stock tank, then left without closing his door all the way. 2 days later, an anonymous complaint hit the county health department claiming my well water was contaminated, typed on the same cream HOA stationery Linda always used. The inspector tested 3 points. All came back cleaner than Ridgecrest's own water, since mine hadn't passed through a mile of unpermitted PVC. Then Glenn made his real mistake. My trail camera logged his truck at 1:47 a.m. the following Tuesday. Infrared footage showed him cutting my lockbox with bolt cutters, ripping out the meter and isolation valve, dumping them in the ditch, and resealing the tap with fresh cement. 11 minutes on my property, at least 3 felonies committed. I called Sheriff Avery at 7. He watched the footage, picked up his radio, and had a unit at Glenn's door within 20 minutes. Glenn was cuffed at his kitchen table. His actual wife, Doreen, dropped a plate of eggs when she saw the badge. Linda arrived at the sheriff's office within the hour, full makeup and tears in progress, calling it a misunderstanding about property boundaries. The deputy handed her a tissue box. "Ma'am, your brother-in-law was filmed destroying equipment on someone else's ranch at 2 a.m. with bolt cutters. That's not confusion. That's a felony." Her own attorney withdrew the next day, telling her the matter had moved well beyond the scope of Homeowners Association governance. The hearing came 3 weeks later, the Blanco County courtroom standing room only. Janet laid it out with surgical precision. The well's chain of ownership from Walter to Earl to me. Ridgecrest's construction file with no well permit anywhere. Glenn's handwritten note on the site plan. Darrell's flow data showing 7.2 million gallons taken over 9 years, worth $216,000 at rural rates, or over $400,000 at commercial replacement cost. Then she played the video, Glenn's face in infrared green, cutting my lock, showing no trace of guilt. I watched Linda instead of the screen. She sat rigid through the first minutes, but when Glenn's handwriting went up, something behind her eyes gave way. By the time the video ended, she was gripping her seat with both hands, holding a face that no longer took direction. The TCEQ inspector delivered the ruling. The unauthorized connection was to be severed within 30 days, and Ridgecrest was required to secure a legal water source at its own expense or face daily fines of $1,000. The county DA announced Glenn was under formal criminal investigation for water theft, construction fraud, and filing false government documents, charges carrying a combined maximum of 15 years. Roy Bennett stood up from the fourth row, his voice steady but his hands shaking. "I paid $340. Zero for a house that doesn't have a legal water source. I have a wife and 2 kids. Where did my money go?" The room erupted. 62 homeowners who'd spent years blaming me for cattle dust and fence aesthetics suddenly realized they'd been living in houses built on stolen water the whole time, while the woman fining them for mailbox angles had been covering for the man stealing it. Judge Lane asked Linda directly whether, as HOA president for 8 years, she'd truly had no knowledge her entire community ran on water illegally drawn from the ranch she'd filed 17 complaints against. Linda opened her mouth. Nothing came out, not a word, from a woman who'd never once been at a loss for one. Then she broke, "You can't do this to me. I built this community." The bailiff walked her out. Her sunglasses fell near the door and nobody picked them up. In the weeks after, Glenn was indicted on 3 felony counts, bail set at $75,000. $40.7 Ridgecrest homeowners filed a class action against him and the HOA. Linda was voted out as president, 58-2, and didn't even attend. Roy said she watched from her Escalade in the parking lot and drove off before the count was announced. TCEQ severed the illegal tap on day 28. My well pressure read 56 psi, the highest in 9 years. Ridgecrest built its own water system from scratch for $620,000, over $10,000 per household, for water they should have had from day one. My settlement came through in January, covering 9 years of pump degradation, aquifer stress, and legal fees. I used part of it to start the Whitfield Water Conservation Fund, offering free system audits to small ranchers in the county. In 6 months, we found 2 more illegal connections elsewhere. Roy brought 12 homeowners to my ranch one Saturday. They apologized, not for the water, which they hadn't known about, but for the letters, the complaints, the petition with a dead man's signature, for believing Linda when she said I was the enemy. I poured them water straight from the tap my grandfather plumbed. Roy said it was the best he'd ever tasted. I told him it always had been. Linda listed her house not long after. The description read, "Stunning hill country retreat with breathtaking views." No mention of the water or where the pipes connected. Some habits are harder to break than PVC buried 18 inches underground. I still walk to the well every morning, check the gauge, listen to the pump, touch the steel cap Grandpa welded in 1962. There's a fund with our name on it now, making sure no rancher in this county loses what's theirs without knowing it. That water never belonged to Linda, never belonged to Glenn. It belonged to a man who drilled 300 feet into limestone and found something worth protecting, and his grandson made sure it stayed that way.